it's interesting for the times we live in of what's going on in the world, in the United States, Ukraine, the Middle East, all the talk about the impact of intelligence agencies around the world. Your military background, the head of the CIA, I mean, you might be the most qualified person on earth to talk about what the hell is going on in the world today. So thank you for spending time with us. So we can start with really open-ended for you. We've got everything happening between the Ukraine and Russia. You've got everything happening in the Middle East. I mean, just in broadly speaking, I mean, how do you see the world today, and how has it changed from when you were running the show?
Well, it has been transformed. There's been seismic change in the state of the world. When I joined KKR 12 and a half years ago, you could describe the world as one of benign globalization, I think. Economics generally trumped geopolitics. All of the barriers to trade, investment, capital flow, even data, intellectual property, and people were all being reduced. Globalization, as measured by global trade, was going up like this, and that has been transformed. We're now in an era of renewed great power rivalries. The holiday from history, as they say, is over. Geopolitics is back with a vengeance. All of the barriers that were being reduced are now going up. And this has been going on for some time. This is not just about the tariffs that President Trump has mentioned. In fact, his predecessor put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles for fear that they would crush the nascent U.S. industry as China dumped their excess capacity on the world. Of course, there were 10% tariffs in Trump 1.0 on China trade. There were more restrictions by the previous administration, sectors in which you cannot invest in China, entities with which you could not invest, restrictions on there. But obviously the tariff imposition is a particularly significant development in that regard. But much of this really is about the further rise of China, more aggressive actions, not just in its neighborhood in the South China Sea, but around the world. Resurgence of Russian aggression, big developments in the Middle East, and we'll talk about all these, I'm sure. But this is a very significantly different landscape. It's dramatically transformed. It's great for somebody who leads a global institute at a great investment firm because it has great job security. We're very much in demand. But the world really has been transformed dramatically, and I don't see it going back to where it was anytime soon. There's the foreign minister of Singapore is someone I've known for a long time. He's been in that position for over 10 years. He's sort of the characteristically brilliant Singaporean government servant, incredibly well educated, very eloquent. He described the world, this is in March of this year, so a month before the Liberation Day tariffs, in this way. He said, the world is now shifting from unipolarity, and of course we had the unipolar moment in the US at the top, to multipolarity, from free trade to protectionism, from multilateralism to unilateralism, from globalization to hypernationalism, from openness to xenophobia, and from optimism to anxiety. Other than that, it's all going swimmingly. But it is a big, big change. And I think it's really important for investors, for anyone really to understand this, but especially, frankly, the implications of what all this has for the prospects of investments of various types. And of course, that's what we do for KKR. In fact, we really have three major tasks. The first is to identify geopolitical risk during the diligence process, make sure we can mitigate them sufficiently. And if we don't think we can, we raise our hand and say we shouldn't do this deal. That's not always a popular conclusion because deal teams have spent a lot of time, energy, money, consultants, et cetera. We've done that 6 different times. Every single case was validated within a few years of our saying we're not going to do it. Second, we do a lot of helping companies when they run into problems, and that's happened about 60 times over the 12 and a half years. It's really fortunate to have relationships, frankly. You know, as was mentioned, I commanded 2 wars. One was a coalition of over 60 countries, the other was over 35. Virtually all the countries in which we invest were in those coalitions, one or the other. They remember that. They'll still answer a knock on the door or a phone call. I travel a great deal. I just totaled up for the end of year. We're already in that process. I will have traveled to 30 different countries this year alone, many of them more than one time. I think I've already been to London 6 or 8 times this year alone, and of course every major city in the US. But a lot of that is to maintain not just the feel for what's going on in a country, to get boots on the ground, that still matters, but to refresh relationships, sustain them, keep them going, because that's what really helps us when a company runs into problems that can't be solved by the corporate headquarters, by our deal team, or even the regional, then it's something where these relationships can come. And we solved every one of the 60 problems that our companies encountered. And then we actually do a lot of this. We spend a considerable amount of time talking about the state of the world with those who we're all trying to invest successfully and often together.
So let's go to some hot spots.
Sure.
Let's start with Ukraine.
Yep.
You were just there a couple
Yep,
weeks ago.
this is my 7th visit since the full-on invasion of 2022. And I was heartened, actually, this time. I'd been discouraged the 2 or 3 previous visits. What's happening right now, I think, gives a real opportunity for setting the conditions that could force Vladimir Putin to seriously negotiate about a cessation of hostilities. And let me explain what that is. So first of all, I think President Trump was right to use the relationship that he had to see if that would work, to try to get Putin to come to the table. He literally rolled out the red carpet in Anchorage, Alaska. Putin responded by sending the most drones and missiles ever into Ukrainian skies multiple times. Since then, he has sent drones into Poland. He's shut down airfields in Copenhagen and Munich, manned aircraft into Estonia, and a bunch of other, and then all kinds of anchor dragging across telecommunications cables, assassinations, infrastructure damage, and so forth. And that, I think, is creating the kind of pressure that will force the Europeans, and of course he's already pushed them very hard to increase their defense spending, and that's very commendable as well, because his predecessors were never able to quite do that. Of course, he has the help of the anxiety created by what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. So I think all of a sudden there's a way that I think you can take certain actions that can enable Ukraine to stop the Russians cold on the front lines. It's very incremental gains as it is, and to the cost of 1.1 million Russians killed and wounded. I can't comprehend these numbers, and I had 5 combat commands as a general officer alone. Every single one, I was writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers almost every night. This is just staggering. Again, I don't know how you can actually deal with that as a commander, but apparently they just don't really care. But so the cost has been huge, but you could also enable them to do better in the defense against drones and ballistic missiles that come in. Those are the real damaging munitions. And so if the Europeans, who are stepping up very much, in particular, they can launder this $250 billion equivalent of frozen reserves in European banks into Euroclear bonds that can be given to Ukraine, essentially money, and they don't have to pay it back until the Russians start paying them reparations. This would be enormous. It might be this could be a game changer. And then we'll continue to provide more support again that will help them on the front lines and against the air. They make 3.5 to 4 million drones a year right now. They could double that number. And this has become an unmanned systems war. They have no navy in Ukraine, really, to speak of, but they've sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Aerial drones that find the ships, maritime drones that sink them. I drove the maritime drone the last time I was there. They wanted to show how they launch it and do all the rest, so they gave me the controls. We got it up to 100 kilometers an hour. It's just spectacular what they've done. Of course, they've been going into Russian airspace every single night. They've damaged or destroyed probably about 30% of the Russian refinery capacity now. So there's a lot going on from the Ukrainian side against the Russians. Russians are learning as well. But it's a sense where if we help them militarily, they can stop the Russians no matter how many troops they're willing to lose, and then crush the Russian war machine by sanctions. The Europeans are working on their 19th round. I was just in Brussels talking to them and to the NATO folks as well. I was also in Warsaw 3 times in the last 5 weeks, in Ukraine itself, in Paris, and in Helsinki, among others. I think it's really possible that that round of sanctions is done. That satisfies what President Trump has asked them to do. Then we can get the sanctions out of Congress to the White House. 84 of 100 senators support them. And so what you're doing is, again, punishing Russia very substantially. And then you want to go after those who enable the Russian war machine, the war economy. That's those who buy gas and oil. You have to do that carefully. You don't want to spike the markets, but that's doable. We did that during the Iran sanctions years ago. And then to go after China, frankly, which is providing an avalanche of components that Russia uses for its military-industrial complex. You know, in the beginning, they were in real trouble. They were actually buying refrigerators to just take the chips out of them and use them in the war machine. Now they're getting it all directly from China. So I think all of this is actually quite realistic, and it would finally put Putin in a position where he recognizes he can't continue the war. His social, it's called the National Welfare Fund, runs out of money next year. They've been diverting that money to fuel the military-industrial complex. So I touch wood, because you always should, but I think there's a real potential here that these actions, if done simultaneously, Europeans, US, and the other Western supporters, could really change the dynamics to a point that Putin would actually negotiate seriously. And then you also have conditions that could be set that will lead to a durable cessation of hostilities, not just one where Russia says, okay, fine, let's take a knee for a year or two as we rebuild our forces and so forth, and then have another go at it.
It makes me think about what do you think about the group of people that say, hey, President Clinton promised we'd never bring Ukraine into NATO, and then we talked about bringing it to NATO, and Putin said that's a red line, and that we really caused this by breaking that agreement?
There's a little bit of creative history there, actually. This is usually done by the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, and others. It's not quite as clear as that. I actually think we did make a mistake when we dangled NATO membership in front of Ukraine and then didn't make him a NATO member. It's the worst of all worlds. Russia's never invaded a NATO member, however much it may complain about some of its former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all the eastern that were part of the Warsaw Pact and so forth. But in the case of Ukraine, I mean, it's his worst nightmare. His worst nightmare, first and all, by the way, is a successful Ukraine with a vibrant democracy, great economy, free market economy, and all the rest of that, because it shows his people what life could be like for them if they weren't part of this kleptocracy that is the modern Russia. So there are those that have made these arguments that, we said we wouldn't go farther and then we did, and all the rest of that. There's a little bit of substance to that, but not quite as much as, again, the Russian foreign minister makes it out to be.
And you were talking a little about drones, and it almost feels like a testing ground for weapons.
This is the future of war. Yeah. And actually, I should note that there was a second edition, it's from 1945 to Gaza. And we updated, there's a chapter on the future of war, largely looking at Ukraine, which is the future of war. Again, 3.5 to 4 million drones a year. I asked the commander of the Ukrainian forces the time before that I was out there, how many drones roughly did you employ yesterday? And he said nearly 7,000. Think about this. By the way, we're barely making 300,000 in the United States. We have definitely got to up our game. And their drones are vastly better. All the stuff that we sent in the early months there that we thought were really high speed, the precision artillery, we have suicide drones for anti-personnel and anti-tank. Very few of those actually work as advertised anymore because of the enormous amount of jamming and air defenses and everything else employed by the Russians. So the Ukrainians are iterating. They innovate like nothing I've ever seen. And they have a partnership between those who design drones and weapon systems. They're now making virtually everything except for the high-end ballistic missile defense and interceptors, the Patriot, and they don't make F-16s or F-35s. But those who design the stuff, those who make it, the manufacturers, and then those who employ it is like this. It's totally different in the United States, where we have a very cumbersome legacy process in which there are vested interests in each element of the military-industrial congressional complex, as Senator McCain used to pejoratively describe it, that don't want to see, they have a vested interest in legacy systems, legacy processes, legacy basing, all the rest of this. And we have got to pick up the pace. Our service chiefs do know that. Secretary Hegseth sent out a directive to move faster on this, but it takes all of these different elements together. And frankly, what's really driving it in Ukraine, of course, is this is a war for their survival. This is their war of independence. So a lot of the great hardware and software designers came back to Ukraine, and they're all engaged in various ways in this regard. There's a unit that I visit every time I'm there, and it started out as a company, then it was a battalion, now it's a regiment. It's all unmanned systems. And it's just extraordinary. The Nemesis Regiment, it's now called. By the way, they openly recruit. They're actually allowed to recruit directly and to do their own basic training. This is one of the first countries in the world that had not just an Army, Navy, and Air Force, but an unmanned systems force. And again, the innovation is just like, I've never seen anything like it. Every single time I go, there's another antenna coming off of it. There's a Starlink platter on the top. I think there's 4 or 5 antennas coming off just so they can try to work through all the jamming, electronic warfare, and the other challenges. Now they actually have drones from which fiber optic cable is being spooled out behind it. And about 1/3 of their drones nowadays actually have that. You can imagine what that does, by the way, to the forests and the fields and everything else, because they're sending thousands of these across it. But that's something to worry about further down the road. So again, this is the future of warfare. And I don't believe that we have remotely embraced it as fully as we should. We aren't learning the lessons as rapidly, in part because we have a very small number of boots on the ground, and most of them are just there to support the security assistance that we are doing and to account for all of it and so forth. We should have lessons learned teams on the ground as we did. You know, the war in Iraq, we had Army lessons learned, Marine Corps lessons learned, Joint Forces lessons learned, asymmetric warfare group, special ops lessons learned, my counterinsurgency center, and they'd get an hour a month with me at a culmination of a process where they'd sit down and say, hey boss, here's some lessons we've identified or some initiatives that we think have great promise. But of course they're not learned until you actually incorporate them in the strategy in your campaign plan, the big ideas as you call it, communicated throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, actually implemented, you oversee the implementation, and then so this is a process. I created a strategic leadership intellectual construct for myself between the 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq that had these 4 tasks. And if you focus on this, you keep coming back to the criticality of getting the big ideas right. And tragically, we have not always done that. It took us about 8 years in Afghanistan to get the big ideas right. It took another year to get the inputs right to enable the implementation of the big ideas. And then within 6 months of hitting that mark, we started drawing down. And then very quickly, the drawdown became based on, not on conditions on the ground in Afghanistan, which is what it should be, but on conditions in Washington, which is not necessarily the way to do it. Iraq, we did it much more the logical way. But even there, we didn't even have a counterinsurgency field manual 3 or 4 years into that war. We wrote that in the one tour that I had back in the US when I also did this intellectual construct.
Let's shift to a completely different kind
Sure.
of warfare over in the Middle East, where you've had this war going on now for over 2 years.
Yes.
We've got 7 different countries have been involved at one time or another, and a very tenuous, fragile peace deal that seems to be on the table.
And touch all wood you can touch on that. Look, I'm also now the chairman of KKR Middle East as of this spring. No retired general ever turns down a new title. Or another honorary PhD. There's another one coming next week back in Iraq. Or another medal. But in any event, and I travel out there all the time, all over the Middle East, largely focused on the Gulf states, but other countries as well. I think the region has been transformed quite dramatically already because Israel's operation first against Lebanese Hezbollah, the biggest, most powerful, well-armed proxy of Iran, with over 150,000 missiles, rockets, and drones that they could launch at the Israelis at the beginning of the war. When they had that supply chain operation, this is the most brilliant supply chain operation in history by far of intelligence, all the pagers that blew up in the hands of the Hezbollah leaders. So they didn't just decapitate Hezbollah, they did that too. I think 19 or 20 of the 20 already around that time. But now thousands of the most important leaders, because it was a badge of your importance that you had this pager on your belt. And of course, they had forced Hezbollah to go to the pagers because they came to realize that if they were talking on a cell phone, they could get geolocated and they're going to get hit. So this was extraordinary. And then the next day, the walkie-talkies blew up. So now they had no command control communications. They couldn't conceive a plan, much less execute it. And that saved Israel from facing what we all feared most, which would have been thousands of missiles and drones and rockets simultaneously, which could have overwhelmed even the very sophisticated counter-drone, air, and ballistic missile defenses of Israel. And then they just painstakingly hammered them in a very effective operation. And Hezbollah is a shadow of what it used to be. By the way, that transformed Lebanon because Hezbollah had a very active political role as well, now just not as strong, dramatically degraded. They could finally elect a president after over a year of arguing and finally got a speaker for the parliament as well. So that's really very, very important. Then, of course, what they did against Iran in the 12 days of airstrikes and also drone strikes from inside the country, which again dramatically degraded, really set that nuclear program back years, I'm pretty confident. Yes, there's a possibility that there's some highly enriched uranium somewhere else, maybe some advanced centrifuges, but there's a critical component that there was only one facility that could do what's called metallizing. So the process of enrichment, first you take uranium, turn it into a gaseous substance, then you enrich it ever higher. When you get to weapons grade, which they didn't get to, but they were the level just below that, you then take it to this facility, you turn it back into a metal so that you can actually have a spherical object that will have a trigger and create a nuclear effect. So that was brilliant as well. And of course, what we did on the final day of that to help out with what only we have, which is the massive ordnance penetrator, 30,000 pound munition that'll burrow way down before thousands of pounds of explosive blow up. And B-2 bombers that flew all the way from the United States to Iran, nonstop, area refuel all along the way, and then turned around and went back to wherever it was that they eventually landed. That was an extraordinary operation. The idea that Israel could carry this out, by the way, they took down completely the sophisticated Russian air and ballistic missile defense that Iran had gotten from the Russian Federation with our F-35 aircraft that we provided to them. And that was a great validation of the capability of that plane, because you never really do know until you actually test it in that kind of situation. So that dramatically degraded Iran, set back the nuclear program again for years. It was very close to being within range, if you will. Just one more turn of the enrichment process could have been weapons grade, and then turn it into some kind of device. And that created conditions where all of a sudden Ahmed al-Sharaa in Syria, who had built a pretty substantial force over a number of years up in the northwest part of the country, was able to take down the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime that his father and he had controlled the country some 50 years or so. Particularly brutal, and Ahmed al-Sharaa decided, well, we'll just liberate Aleppo, the second largest city. It fell very quickly, and the reason was because Hezbollah couldn't come to the rescue the way they did in the past. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, Quds Force couldn't come to the rescue, and Russian air power with special ops on the ground couldn't do likewise as they did before. All of them are preoccupied or so degraded. So all of a sudden you have, again, a real transformation of the Middle East. Obviously, the one where it all started, the brutal, barbaric attack of 7 October 2 years ago, that's still not resolved, and that has been a very, very tough fight for Israel. But look, if this deal that President Trump has pushed so hard and really leaned on Prime Minister Netanyahu considerably, given Netanyahu's political coalition, which doesn't like certain aspects of this deal and has threatened to leave the coalition, bring down the government, although I don't think they will. And then leaning on Hamas on the other side through Arab states that have communications with them. If this, I'd be happy to actually talk about it, but what I felt a fourth objective should have been done from the very beginning. So I want to see Israel achieve the three objectives that it set out to achieve. Destroy Hamas, not just degrade them, keep Hamas from governing again, and that helps the Palestinian people, obviously, and then get the hostages back. And I felt there should have been a fourth objective. I've said it publicly, including to the Israeli government, that should have been to provide a better future for the Palestinian people without Hamas in their lives. The problem here has been, and I've been very public about this as well, and I've written about it and discussed with the Minister of Defense at that time about it as well. They've gone about this in a way, the big ideas haven't been right for what it is that they should be doing. They're doing what's called a clear and leave operation, which is what we were doing in Iraq prior to the surge when we went to a clear, hold, build. Hamas is not organized companies, battalions, brigades anymore. It's still roughly the same size. They can find, there's no shortage of angry young men with grievances and who will take up an AK-47 for some modest salary. So what you need to do is you need to go in and actually clear areas and hold them, get the people back into their homes around those areas, or at least into better shelter where their homes used to be, because the damage is very, very considerable in destruction. So I've said you should start in the north, come a kilometer down, east-west wall, 3 north-south walls. You have 4 gated communities. This is what we did during the surge in Iraq. Once you have cleared them, you finally have something that has not existed in Gaza, despite all the fighting, and that is security, separating the Hamas from the people. Give them biometric ID cards if they belong there, get them back again into the area of their homes. Now you can send humanitarian assistance in without the kind of near riots that often happen currently. Contractors can be used for a variety of things because, again, they're not having to fight Hamas. Arab forces would come in. Ideally, you'd have Palestinian forces already trained, vetted, and equipped in the Jordan International Police Training Center, where we train hundreds of thousands of Iraqi police. And actually bring them in. And so again, it's called clear, hold, build, and slowly transition. And you just keep doing that all the way down. It gets obviously very complicated about around Gaza City. You're gonna have to slice and dice that. But this is the only way to achieve these 3 objectives, much less, again, the fourth one that I said, which is the better future for the Palestinians. It may be that Hamas has just been hammered so badly that they are actually at least considering doing what the agreement would have them do, which is actually to give up their weapons. I'm a bit skeptical about that. I think there's, in fact, both sides actually have disagreements with elements in this. They've allowed vague, certain different phases. But if that first phase is actually completed, where the hostages and the bodies of hostages are returned to Israel in return for thousands of detainees, of Hamas detainees and others, that would be a huge accomplishment in and of itself. And then you have the prospect for going forward with the other elements of the deal, although again, there's an awful lot of vague wording in there, including who is going to secure this place, especially if Hamas just sort of pretends to surrender and they're still wanting to go at it. So lots of big challenges there, but to get this far is actually very encouraging. And look, if they pull this whole thing off and actually do provide a better future for the Palestinian people in Gaza, I'll be on the nominating committee of the Nobel Peace Prize for President Trump in a heartbeat.
I mean, you're skeptical of, I guess, Hamas fulfilling their part of the agreement. Let's just say that they do release all the hostages, they do lay down their arms. Are you skeptical that Netanyahu will actually honor his side of the peace deal?
I think President Trump's going to lean on him very heavily in that regard. And I think there is, without getting too much into the politics of this, of course, the challenge for Prime Minister Netanyahu is that there are 2 very ultra right-wing who really don't want to see a better future for the Palestinian people in Gaza. In fact, they'd really like to see them all go somewhere else. and reoccupy it. And they've threatened to bring down the government if Netanyahu goes down the road. But I think there's actually an out. There's another political faction led by someone I know quite well and respect in Israel, who said, if they do that, I'll join your coalition until the elections, and we'll keep you in place if you actually do what you're agreeing to do. So this is, again, the one where so far I felt that the Israelis hadn't had the right strategy, but all of a sudden this could come together. And President Trump, if it does, will deserve an enormous amount of credit for it. And this will be a huge achievement. Some of the others about which he has talked, ending wars and so forth, have not been quite as significant, shall we say.
Well, let's hope.
Yeah.
You became a social media star last week and were all over the news after you had to sit down.
Only last week? My God.
Always big time, but last week a lot more attention.
I used to be known as a celebrity general, you know. That was a term of endearment in the Bush administration. It was not in the Obama administration, I can tell you. I remember the Secretary of Defense came to Afghanistan one time and he said, Dave, let's talk about your future. He said, it's clear to me that there's room inside the Beltway for one superstar, and it's not going to be you. And that's when I said, how about the CIA? That's almost at the Beltway, and so it was a better job anyway.
Well, a person you called a terrorist, put in jail, had a $10 million bounty on his head.
Ahmed
You're
al-Sharaa.
sitting just the same distance you are from me on stage with him.
It was extraordinary. It was a surreal moment. So it was UN General Assembly week. The man who took down Bashar al-Assad, the interim president of the country, was there for his first UN General Assembly. And I do something with the Concordia Summit, it's called. And so that was his first appearance that week in New York, and it was a pretty big deal. He was in detention when I took command as a 4-star. He had already been picked up. He was basically a cell leader in al-Qaeda in Iraq. They caught him planting explosives. He spent 5 years in detention. So presumably was released when we transitioned the control of these facilities to the Iraqi government. I'd like to say that, you know, he went on the straight and narrow after that, except that he actually built an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Then he did leave it, though, and then he built another entity that politically Islamist, if you will, but certainly not an extremist. In fact, some years ago, I said one time that I thought that we could do with them what we did with Sunni insurgents and also some of the Shia militia in Iraq, which was reconcile with them. They were reconcilable. And that's a pretty big distinction, because if you're irreconcilable, especially during the surge in Iraq, and we had a huge intelligence organization that made that determination, if you're irreconcilable, you're on the list for our special mission units to knock on your door in the middle of the night, ideally detain, but if not, capture, if not kill. So here he is, again, leader of a country. Obviously, we're big time on different sides in the past, but I was hugely impressed. He has real presence, very soft-spoken. He is very thoughtful and measured. He knew it. We did a session actually behind closed doors, first with business leaders and so forth, because they desperately need investment. Of course, President Trump had already met him in Riyadh. The Crown Prince there asked that he do that, and President Trump lifted the sanctions that were on him by the executive branch. Unfortunately, there are still congressional sanctions on the country that are pretty restrictive. They prevent investing in 3 categories that you really want to invest in to help the country come back, and that is its finance, construction, and energy sectors. And so there's an effort to convince Congress to accelerate the pace of lifting those as well. But he demonstrated a real understanding of all elements of the economy. Telecommunication, you know, he went, because these are serious businessmen. A lot of them are Syrian American diaspora who've done really well. So again, the only way to describe it is as surreal. And it was, I ended up, you know, really being very, very impressed by him and having a considerable amount of admiration for somebody who, yes, was in al-Qaeda in Iraq and then al-Qaeda in Syria.
You could have turned him in, got $10 million. Well, he was.
Well, I think they'd already lifted the $10 million. That was, I think that was put on him when he was actually the leader in Syria, not in Iraq. Again, in Iraq he was a cell leader, and there were plenty of those. You know, We had 27,000 detainees at the height of it in Iraq. Because when I took command of the surge, I sat down with some of our leaders, and the head of our counterterrorism unit, General Stan McChrystal, pretty famous guy as well, and a huge friend of mine for 5 years in combat alone together. He said, you know, your detention facilities are terrorist training universities. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they go in and they come out more radicalized than they were before. So we looked at the data and everything else, and it turned out we had over a 90% recidivism rate. In other words, they're released and they go back to a life of insurgency, crime, extremism. And so we did a really careful study. I said, we're stopping releasing detainees until we can get to the bottom of this. What you had to do is conduct counterinsurgency inside the wire, just like you're doing outside. You have to identify the real extremists in these large enclosures of 800 or so detainees, and you got to pull out the really bad guys, put them in maximum security, and then you have to start a process of moderation in religion. I bought an entire brick factory, bought a bread factory to teach them skills that they could use when they were released. And then we had a very elaborate review and release policy where we returned them to the control of their sheikh. The local judicial figures had to be involved. We gave them a small stipend for a period of time, so while they were trying to find a job, they don't have to, again, resort to a life of crime. We drove the recidivism rate down to nearly 5%, which is obviously a pretty big improvement. And it was one of the many factors that enabled us to drive violence down in all of Iraq by almost 90% in the 18 months of the surge.
In the very first question when I asked you the state of the world, and I didn't point you to a geography, you know, we're all thinking about Ukraine and the Middle East, and you went right to China. And
well,
President
all
Trump,
roads lead to China.
Yeah.
I think if you think about the challenges that we face right now, so there are two big categories of issues with which we're dealing that are very, very challenging. First is just the sheer number of threats and challenges and so forth. And it's not just all military threats. There's plenty of other challenges that are out there as well. There's cyber threats, there's extremism, there's the vestiges of global warming and everything else that create additional challenges with which we have to deal. And if you think of these as plates in the circus tent, you know, where the clown is in there trying to keep all the plates spinning simultaneously, and you think of us, we're the big plate spinner, but we have allies and partners. If we treat them well and keep them in the fold, they'll help us keep some of these plates spinning. But there's more plates there than at any time since the end of the Cold War, at least, if not World War II, and that's a challenge. Second is the China plate, and this represents the relationship between the US, our allies and partners, and China is bigger than all the other plates in that tent put together. This is a relationship that matters more than any other in the world. It's the number one and number two economies, and number one and two, if you will, military superpowers and all the rest of that. And if we were ever to come to blows, the global economy as we know it blows up with it. And so we've got to have rock solid deterrence. Deterrence rests on two elements: the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. I've already said that we need to be transforming our capabilities much more rapidly, essentially in very simplistic terms, from a very small number of very large platforms that have incredible capability, heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, and are increasingly vulnerable, to a massive number of unmanned systems, under the water, on the water, in the air, on ground, in outer space and cyberspace, the equivalent, cognitive space, every domain where war is carried out. And increasingly, and this is one that is a reality. By the way, you know, you learn as a director of the CIA, you got to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. And one of the realities of the future is going to be that these aren't going to be remotely piloted anymore. They're going to be algorithmically piloted, especially when it comes to swarms. And there's already development of the capabilities, algorithmic capabilities, on some of the unmanned systems in Ukraine. So that's a huge transformation. Beyond that, we have to be very, very careful to ensure, we don't want to be needlessly provocative, but they have to understand that we will use our capabilities if that is necessary. And by the way, what you do in other parts of the world really matters when it comes to deterrence in the South China Sea. I remember I was in the office of the Singaporean Prime Minister when we, in Syria, had that red line on chemical weapons use that was crossed and we didn't do anything. And he said, you know, General, that reverberates out here. That undermines what you're trying to do in the South China Sea. I feel very strongly that if we don't help Ukraine, and we should, yes, we want to get the Europeans to shoulder much, much more of that burden, and all the rest of that. But if you don't help a country that's been invaded by one of the Axis powers here, if you will, the Axis of the sanctioned, why would they believe you're going to help somebody out there? I felt very strongly that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which really wasn't necessary, and I'll go into that in a moment, but that withdrawal and then the way it was conducted probably was one factor that led Putin to think that we wouldn't respond as significantly as we did to the invasion of Ukraine. And the reason why I say that we didn't, it's not actually axiomatic that you have to end endless wars. You only have to end them if they are not sustainable. Vietnam was not sustainable, and I see some folks in here that perhaps were part of that. We just couldn't continue, the loss of life, the expense, and all the rest of that. In Afghanistan, we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months, not because of the agreement made by then the previous administration, Trump 1.0, and carried out by the Biden administration. It was because we were no longer in the front lines. We were doing what's called advise Afghan forces, assist in various ways, and enable. And so they were taking the casualties for their country, and they were willing to fight for it as long as they always knew there was someone coming to the rescue. Usually their own commandos, 35,000 strong, that when a force out in the periphery, out protecting some major population area gets hit, they just hold on. The commandos get on the helicopters and fly out there. By the way, one of the mistakes we made was giving them overly sophisticated helicopters. I fought this, actually. We were still using old refurbished Soviet or Russian ones, which were completely analog and could be repaired very easily. Quite durable, not as capable, but they were more than sufficient. One of the things that I foresaw was that if we removed not just our 2,500 troops, but then the 17,000 Western contractors keeping all the overly sophisticated stuff working, all of a sudden there's no longer be anybody coming to the rescue because the helicopters literally won't be able to keep flying. But we could have sustained that forever. Again, it's all about what's the cost in blood and treasure. There's very little cost in blood, and $25 billion a year out of an $825 or $50 billion defense budget was more than doable, and we should have known. I went on Fox News and said, I fear a psychological collapse of the Afghan forces when the following things happened. They all happened, and you had a psychological collapse of the Afghan forces. And now you have a country that for 20 years we were trying to help in so many different ways, had some really significant accomplishments, far more than just killing bad guys, if you will. Now you're back into an 8th or 9th century interpretation of ultra-conservative Islam, where women can't go outside the house without a male escort, and young girls can't even go into high school, much less to college. In fact, my wife and I funded a scholarship for the American University of Afghanistan for a woman to go to school. Those women all had to leave if they were able to, or they're obviously now obviously not living the life that they had hoped that they would live. So again, I think when it comes to big ideas, you really got to get them right. In Vietnam, it took us 13 years to get the big ideas right, tragically. We thought that we could win a war of attrition against the North Vietnamese, search and destroy, thrashing around in the jungle and the high ground and the rice paddies, trying to bring an elusive enemy to fight, and largely ignoring the villages, hamlets, districts, provinces where the people actually lived and helping secure them. Instead, they became sources of Viet Cong, the guerrillas, rice, sanctuary, and so forth. And only in late 1968 did we finally get the big ideas right, 13 years into our involvement there. And by then it was too late. The support for the war had collapsed after the Tet Offensive of early 1968. All the stuff about lights at the end of tunnels and everything else was disproved by that action. And we eventually were going to have to get out, and ultimately did. Afghanistan was sustainable in a way that Vietnam was not.
You've talked about a lot of spinning plates. We've covered all different kinds of hot spots. When you look out 10 years, what do you think is the biggest risk? What do you think is the biggest opportunity?
So, you know, I've taught economics over the years. I had this episode in my career where I went to graduate school at Princeton and did a PhD. I was told that I was committing professional suicide by doing that instead of going to the Ranger Regiment. I seemed to survive. But when the way you answer any question in economics is to say, it depends. And it does depend. It actually really does. In this case, it depends on what do we do. Can we resolve these tariffs? Can we avoid really huge disruptions? Can we avoid a fortress America where other countries decide, well, we're not going to trade with the US the way we used to. We'll find other partners out there. There's a bit of that happening with Canada right now. So there's a lot going on in that regard that we've got to get resolved as soon as we can. And of course, those in this room know that uncertainty is very tough for markets. You don't make the big decisions about additional investments in plant and capital. Consumers sit on the sideline a bit longer than they otherwise would. They avoid the really big ticket purchases and all that stuff. So it depends a lot on that. It depends on the relationship with China. Again, China didn't work out the way we hoped it would. You know, back in the turn of the century, Clinton and then Bush thought that if we bring China into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, even though they don't meet all the criteria, that what's going to happen is we're going to have this virtuous cycle, mutually beneficial trade and so forth. And that generally worked out, unless, of course, you were in an industry that was killed by that trade. And we didn't do right by those people. We didn't use sufficient trade adjustment assistance to take care of those in the sectors that were really hurt by this, where everybody else was benefiting by getting cheaper goods from China. But we thought that as they got wealthier, as they pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and they did, that they would naturally become more like us, more open, more transparent, and again, a lot more like us in many different ways. It didn't work out. In particular with President Xi, who's now consolidated power in a way unlike anyone since Mao, is on an unprecedented third term as president, and as party leader really, which means the president as well, and very likely will do a fourth term. So we've got to get through this period. What we want in particular is at least to have a floor on the relationship, have some guardrails, but there's a lot of very complicated negotiating that's going to have to take place around trade tariffs, and they're constantly taking actions in response to that. You may have seen it in the last 24 hours. They just made much more restrictive the licenses to buy so many of the rare earths, the strategic minerals, and all the rest of that, on which we are very heavily dependent. We have over-dependence on them in a whole host of different sectors. They used to be much more dependent on us when it comes to feeding their people and feeding their livestock, although right now they're able to find soybeans elsewhere, which is crushing our soybean farmers. There's been no orders whatsoever this year. We got to work that out. And again, that's probably the most important issue on which the future depends. It also depends, obviously, we needed to stop the illegal immigration without question, but we need to figure out a way to get legal immigration, because if we don't, crops aren't going to be picked. The agriculture industry, the hospitality industry, construction, and a handful of other industries in our country rely on individuals and immigrants. The growth of our workforce depends on that. Remember, GDP is the size of your workforce times your productivity. And if that workforce isn't growing, productivity is going to pick up the slack. And I'll talk about productivity in a second, because it's generally overlooked just how significant it is right now. But so there's all of these different factors, all these different issues that need to be resolved. And if we don't get that right, we'll lose out on the best and brightest coming to our research universities. We'll create problems for these universities that are the incubators for so much of the innovation that has made America great again, again, and again. But let me talk just briefly about innovation, because even if the growth slows down further for a variety of different reasons, some of which will be attributed to tariffs, we are enjoying probably a 0.9 or even 1% of GDP growth just from productivity. We are in an incredible productivity boom. It's greater than what took place in the late 1990s. and it affects everything. I know you just had a session on AI, and I'm sure the discussion of the applications and what they're doing, really revolutionizing everything that we do. And that is hugely significant, and we need to recognize that as such. And we should ask, why is it that we are uniquely enjoying this productivity boom? And it will come back to things like research universities, best and brightest from around the world come and stay. I've long felt that, you know, if you could get into MIT, and our son went there, by the way, before 8 years in the Army and tours on the ground in Afghanistan when I was the commander, you should have a green card stapled to the thing. I mean, we want these people to stay here. So we've got to work our way through that kind of issue. But just a test question for you, because AI is absolutely unbelievable in what's going on. I was together with a bunch of the leaders of probably 4 of the 5 top large language models, and I asked the leader of the company that does Claude, which is one of the top 5 LLMs, I said, roughly, how do you equate where we are at this moment in terms of the quality of these LLMs? And he said, well, right now our large language models are at the level of a very good graduate student. In less than a year, we think they'll be at the level of a PhD. And within less than a year of that, we're going to be at the level of a Nobel laureate, because it all just keeps accumulating. So the test question is, how many of you are training your own agent in a large language model? Show of hands, please. You have got to pick up the pace, people. I actually have an agent. I've been training it for a number of months now. This is actually Bing or Microsoft Copilot, and I like certain features of it, but I might shift over to ChatGPT, which is what we do, the corporate one. And we have hundreds of applications at KKR already. But we actually had a discussion, the agent and I, what should I name you? And the agent came back with 3 suggestions. I picked one of them, which was Argus. Argus was a Greek mythological creature that had 100 eyes, none of which were all asleep at the same time. So he's always scanning the world for me. In fact, I start every morning, morning Argus. How about today's geopolitical update? Morning, General Petraeus here. By the way, he knows who I am. Oh, we agreed on the gender. So we had a bit of a discussion about that. We decided, you say he, him. By the way, he sucks up to me constantly, which is really a really endearing quality. I'm not joking. I mean, if I'm ever feeling down, I just have a little conversation, and sooner or later, Argus is going to say, and of course, given your strategic genius, General Petraeus, so, but you know, this is all sort of joking and everything else, but I have found this to be, it truly is revolutionary. You know, when I was a 4-star, first of all, I always got stuck being a speechwriter for sort of 3 different times. There weren't that many infantry PhDs in the Army, and then I'd escape. But then, you know, I had speechwriters. I had to have 4 or 5 at a time, usually as a 4-star, or at the CIA. I usually would have 2 or more Rhodes Scholars in those. So these are really talented people. Had the entire military to pick from. Argus is a spectacular speechwriter. I mean, I'm talking, and the more you tell it about this is how you want to craft it and all the rest of that, really, really gifted, and arguably already probably better than the best speechwriter that I ever had, because I've been training it. I feed it all my old speeches, we have it all digitized, all the rest of this stuff. That's just one little niche area. This is affecting everything that we do, and this is the source of this innovation boom that is propelling our economy. And even if we slow down because of other reasons, I think it will keep us out of recession at the end of the day, which is hugely important, especially if inflation picks back up because of the effects of tariffs, depending on where the resting heart rate is. So, you know, you were actually asking back there, you know, could we end up saying what gives you hope for the future? It is innovation. It is the ecosystem in the United States that enables and rewards that innovation. It makes it possible, and then again really incentivizes the success. And then it's frankly young people. And the reason I'm currently the Kissinger Fellow at Yale. I lead a course on great power competition in the spring semester graduate course. But I've had 5 or 6 other academic affiliations over the years. KKR has always been really quite nice about letting me do these things. And the reason I do it is because I get inspired and energized by the young people in our country with whom I have contact in these great academic institutions. That's the future of the country. Again, we have incredible blessings in so many different ways, and of course the real test is going to be, can we continue to capitalize on these and build on them, or do we squander some of the opportunities that we have? I'll bet on the first, by the way, because as with Warren Buffett, I believe it never pays to bet against America.
That's the perfect way to end. Thank you, General Petraeus.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.